Okay. Our usual start time is here. As we continue through our Security Plus course, we are in module number 4. I'm going to talk about vulnerability management. That is the subject matter of the week. Vulnerability management plays a crucial role in identifying, prioritizing, and remediating vulnerabilities in our environments. They detect new vulnerabilities as they arise and implement a remediation workflow that addresses the highest priority vulnerabilities. You need to know what your weak spot is. And that is exactly what you do with vulnerability management. You find out all the weak spots and you work to secure them from a possible attack. The first step is identifying your targets. What is the data classification of the information that is being stored, that is being processed or transmitted by a system? Is the system exposed to the internet or other public or semi-public networks? What services are being offered by the system? And is the system a production, a test, or development? You must define what systems are in your organization. You have to do the most boring thing, inventory. Without figuring out what you have on your network, it's kind of hard to patch all the possible ways someone can get in. It's the equivalent of moving into a new home. The first thing you're going to do is know how many windows, know how many doors, know how many ways in and out someone can go through your house. You have to do the exact same thing for technology. And while that sounds like duh, but we also have to count how many routers, how many switches, how many Internet of Things, how many access points, how many laptops, desktops are on this network. It's definitely not a straightforward task anymore. After you figure out how many devices, how many systems are on the network you are going to protect, then we have to handle the criticality. Figuring out priority. What systems need to be checked first versus last? In what order? Then comes the frequency. Cybersecurity professionals depend on automation to be efficient and effective. And it makes our life just a bit easier. We have to factor the number of influences on a scan, because you can't just run a scan. You have to have some thoughts behind it. For example, the risk appetite. If an organization is risk averse, it may choose to conduct scans more frequently. There's regulatory requirements. There are certain laws that have to be followed that dictate a minimum number of scans. There's technical constraints. Some devices just can't handle a lot of scans at once. They may crash. That might be a production system that the company or client needs. We can't crash a system. Business constraints. We do not want to slow down the business. So our scans may have to be limited in order to allow the business to continue working. And licensing. Some scanners require a certain license that you have to pay for in order to do a number of things or consume a set amount of bandwidth. Scans should just not be done without much thought. It's definitely not something that you use just spray and pray. there are sensitivity levels. You have to be careful about the configuration settings. They determine the type of checks that the scanner will perform and should be customized to ensure the scan meets the objectives while minimizing the possibility of disrupting the target environment. There are tons of ways to improve the scan with like third-party plugins, and each one could perform a specific task. You really want to disable the number of false positives while also getting the true positives and not hurting the client. Basic vulnerability scans run over a network, probing the system from a distance. This will provide a realistic view of the system security by simulating what an attacker might see from another network's vantage point. Things like firewalls, IDS, IPSs, and other security controls along the path may provide an inaccurate view of the security independent of those controls. Vulnerability scanners can use credentials to allow a scanner to connect to a target and retrieve configuration to determine if a vulnerability exists, improving its accuracy. Some tools have an agent that can do an inside-out approach. And of course, scanners themselves are not immune to vulnerabilities. You also have to keep them up to date just like any other tool. Like these three. Some of the well-knowns. Nessus, Qualsys, Nexpose from Rapid7, OpenVAS. These are vulnerability scanning tools. Application scanning, which is different from what we've just been talking about. These three are network scanning tools. Then we have application scanning tools. Those are part of the software development process. And there's three techniques to those, guys. Those are the static, who analyze code without executing it. The dynamic, who run code exposing to a variety of inputs and searching for vulnerabilities. And interactive, where it's a mix of both. Web application scanners do the same job but for web stuff, to find things like SQL injection or SQLi, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, and etc. Those tools are things like Burp Suite, OWASP Zap, Nikito, and so on. So just having Nessus or just having OpenVAS is not good enough. It's good if you're doing a network scan, but if you need to do a web scan, Nessus may not be the way to go. You'll probably have to use Burp. If you need to do application scanning, it probably won't be either one. It'll probably have to be something like Ghidra or GDB or OllyDebug. Does this make sense to anyone? Okay, some, yes. As you see, there is overlap, and there's a reason why there's overlap between 76 and 75. In the realm of security, everyone should know this. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have it memorized, but you do need to be able to read it. Kind of like sheet music. You need to be able to read it. This is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, an industry standard for assessing the severity of security vulnerabilities. It gives you a solid way of putting a rating to a vulnerability. So let's dive through it. AV, as you see shown here, is the attack vector. Describes how an attacker would exploit the vulnerability. So, an attacker could get to it through physical, like physically touching the device, local, by being logged in, adjacent, or through the network. You also see a column for the score. This score is part of the overall score for the vulnerability. So if an attacker can exploit a vulnerability through the network, it gets a score of 0.85. The next section is the attack complexity. Describes the difficulty of exploiting the vulnerability. Either high or low, and both have their specific score. Next is privileges required. Describe the type of account access that an attacker would need to exploit a vulnerability. And it's either high, low, or none. Why would none have a higher score than the other two? Yes, because it's easier to exploit. Next is user interaction. Do we need a human to do something? And it's either going to be no, or none, or required. We have the scope metric. Describes whether the vulnerability can affect system components beyond the scope of the vulnerability. While it doesn't have a score, the value is reflected in the values of the privileges required. Right? Does it change the machine? We also have confidentiality. I think we talked about in week 1. So how it affects it. How it affects integrity, and how it affects availability. Time for some math. My favorite thing in the whole wide world. Here is a vulnerability. And check it out. It has a base score of 7.5. And this is from 0 to 10. So how did we get to that point? How do we get to 7.5 when we're starting at 3? Well, there's those 3 that we need to figure out the impact subscore. So replace those with their numbers for a total of 0.56. We take the impact score and add what we got from the last to come up with 3.6. If the scope metric changes, then we have to use a different formula to figure this out. The exploitability score is all of this. And that's 8.2 times the attack vector times the complexity times the privileges required in user interaction. Or something more like that. So if the impact is 0, then the base is 0. If the scope is unchanged, then base equals impact plus exploitability. If it's changed, then we have to use a different formula, with the highest again being 10. So in our example, the scope did not change, so it's impact plus exploitability to give us that 7.5. They are categorized from none to critical. So it just so happens that our vulnerability here is sitting in high. It's crazy the math that we have to do in order to prove to folks like the C-suite that we have to patch, we have to install, we have to purchase X, Y, and Z to keep ourselves safe. This is the whole point of that math is to be able to talk to the financial people and help them understand, because they understand numbers, so we have to turn our stuff into something they understand, and that's the way to do it. Patches for vulnerabilities should be verified. Just because a vulnerability scanner said, hey, you need to install a patch, doesn't necessarily mean you do. You always want to double check. You want to handle false positives. You want to handle true positives. And you want to take out all the false negatives. You want to be right, if we were to say this in other words. You want to make sure that what you're saying to the folks, especially to the folks who handle the money, when it comes to, hey, we need to purchase this piece of software, we need to purchase this hardware, we need to do these upgrades. You want to be right. So when you do a vulnerability scan, you see the results, you get all these base scores, and you do all this math. You want to make sure that you're right. So here's an example of something that needs to get installed because it's critical. Well, you don't just want to immediately throw the patch on the system. I understand that it says critical, so that means we need to take care of it. But you want to test the patch before you install it on your production systems, because the last thing you want is you saw that big red critical and you threw the patch on the system because it was the right thing to do. You did not test it and it broke other things. That is your nightmare. When you run your vulnerability scan and you get that, hey, you need to do some patch management. Okay, let's verify, number one. And number two, let's test to make sure it doesn't kill our production. It doesn't bring down our business. A lot of companies have legacy platforms, and all software is eventually discontinued. So organizations that continue to run outdated software put themselves at significant risk of attack. And unless you have a team of operating system developers, you have to find another way around. It's not always easy or straightforward to upgrade to a newer operating system due to things like the hardware or the software restrictions. A best practice when you are in that scenario of supporting a business who has outdated hardware or software and knowing that they have vulnerabilities like these. A best practice would be to isolate that system as much as possible, pairing with increased monitoring and strict firewall rules. Because if that outdated piece of software or that outdated computer is required for that business to make its money, you're gonna have to support it even if it's running server 2003 and it's 2021. You can't take it offline, but you can provide more visibility. You can restrict what gets to it. Error messages. While debug mode provide developers with crucial information in order to troubleshoot applications, it also gives out a lot of detailed information about the inner workings. Debugging should be disabled for any internet-facing system, because the last thing you want is for it to spill the beans onto what type of system is running in the back. That will provide an attacker with the necessary info to create a successful attack. Insecure protocols. Many of the older protocols were not designed with security in mind. And sometimes you have the availability to switch to, instead of using Telnet, to use SSH. Instead of using FTP, to use SFTP or FTPS. To use HTTPS instead of HTTP. But again, that's not always guaranteed, because some systems may just be too old to be able to handle it, or too weak. Like IoT devices can't do encryption. The choice is made to the algorithm that's going to be used to perform encryption or decryption, along with the keys, have a profound impact on the security of an environment. Weak algorithms are easily defeated by an attacker. Easy guessable keys will be found in cryptographic attacks. Strong encryption and preventing systems from downgrading is the exact word, from downgrading to older, weaker ciphers is definitely a good move. Moving on to the last subject, penetration testing. Cybersecurity defenders like yourselves will spend the majority of your time designing controls and defenses to protect information and systems against a wide array of known and unknown threats. Pen testers just need to find a single vulnerability that they might exploit to achieve their goal. Pen testers essentially think like a criminal, finding a single point of entry. They may attempt hundreds or thousands of potential attacks, but all it takes is one for them to be victorious. So us as cybersecurity professionals need to be able to win every time, whereas the attacker just needs to win once. Pen testing provides visibility into an organization's security posture that just isn't available by other means. These tests complement and build on the efforts that are put in place. The tests provide knowledge that we can't obtain anywhere else, learning whether an attacker of similar knowledge, skill, and information would likely be able to penetrate the defenses. Pen tests also provide a blueprint for remediation, allowing the trace of actions through different stages of the attack and close a series of doors the pen testers were able to pass through. Lastly, these focus tests allow us to drill into specific defenses and provide actionable insight to prevent a vulnerability from exposure. There are three main types of pen tests. The white box, where the tester has full knowledge of everything. Black box, where the tester is not provided with any information and it most simulates a real-world attack. And a gray box, which is a hybrid of the two. I have a much longer conversation about this in 76, about the rules of engagement. But for your knowledge, for the Security Plus, you need to be aware that you have to have a rules of engagement when you bring a pen tester on board. You have to figure out a timeline of when the testing can be conducted, the locations, the computers or systems, the applications and other targets, how data will be handled, because we're going to deal with sensitive information, what behaviors are expected, the resources that are going to be committed, any and all legal concerns, who needs to be talked to, when, and the biggest of them all, the permission. Within pen testing, in a very broad sense, because Security Plus doesn't deal in penetration testing, that's what Pen Test Plus is for, but Security Plus does touch on it. There's the recon phase. Once the permission, the paperwork is all done and set underway, then comes recon, where the pen tester gathers as much information as possible about the organization. In a white box testing environment, the client already supplied everything. So this is really more of a step to verify the information before moving on to the next step. A data gathering can be through passive reconnaissance, seeking information without engaging the target, like Googling. There's also active reconnaissance, which is you doing port scans, fingerprinting to identify operating system and applications, and doing vulnerability scanning. For wireless networks, this could mean gaining access to the network without physically entering it, like war driving or using a drone. After the pen tester has all the information they need and can put together a viable attack, then comes the actual running of the test. This is actually one of the shortest parts of the entire process. The big S being the reconnaissance. So during the pen test, attackers will attempt initial access through a vulnerability, do things like privilege escalation, which is logging on as one user and then moving up. So like a regular user to a power user to an administrator. Pivoting or lateral movement, moving to another machine, another device on the network. And persistence, installing backdoors or other mechanisms in order to regain access later, even if the system becomes patched, the initial one that they used. After that comes cleaning up. At the conclusion of the test, all the traces of the work, including the tools, the mechanisms, all that data has to be removed off the vulnerable systems. The report has to be put together to talk about how things were discovered and what can be done to improve. And then that's delivered to the client. Any questions on the stuff we talked about today? Okay, seeing none. I know it says 4.2. I removed lab 4. Oh no, a teacher removed a thing to do. You have one less thing to do? Oh no. The pain, the sorrow. Complete 3 try hack me rooms that relate to things like vulnerability management. So things like OpenVAS or Nessus. That is your lab this week. Getting some hands-on time with some of the tools that are used for vulnerability management. Sound good? Excellent.